tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling, saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that belongs to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But then he came to himself and said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, and here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. And yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'"
Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. This is the ultimate short story. At least, that's what some writers would say. It has all the important parts of a short story in it. It has a strong beginning, middle, and a cliffhanger ending. And it has a plot twist that not many would have expected. The father turns around and completely forgives the younger son. That's something that would have shocked people in Jesus' time, and it still catches people off guard today. This is a story of shame. So many of the younger son's actions were shameful, and would have caused so much embarrassment for his family. And yet, it is also one of love. His father accepts him when he returns in a way that was shocking to many. He showers his love upon the son, a sign of his complete mercy and forgiveness. This is also a story that is well known to many. Elements of it have even worked their way into popular culture. Expressions like the fatted calf come from it, and many people have heard of the prodigal son. And yet, the son is not the hero of this story. When I was doing research for this sermon, I came across several writers who argued that this story should, in fact, be called the parable of the loving father, because that is truly the heart of this story. Some also called this the gospel within the gospels, because it boils so much of our Christian faith, especially God's forgiveness, down into one little story. I bet we would be hard-pressed to go out there and find someone in our society who hadn't heard the story of the prodigal son. It's probably up there with the Good Samaritan. And yet, I wonder how many have a strong grasp on this story. I'll be honest, I myself would sometimes skim over it when reading the Bible, or zone out a little when someone is proclaiming it. I think this is probably because I feel like I know it so well. And yet, when I actually sat down to write this sermon and did some research into it, there were quite a few things that surprised me within the text. So let's get back to the shame thing. In our society, people often talk about being ashamed or embarrassed by something they did. People often feel ashamed or guilty if they do something that they, or others, think is wrong. And yet, we have very little idea of what it would have been like in Jewish society in Jesus' time, or even other societies around the world. In many cases, shame extends beyond the individual into the family unit, with the family members also taking on this sense of shame. I had one experience that sticks out and always comes to mind when I hear the word shame. When I was 10 years old, my family had an exchange student from South Korea come and live with us for a month. She was 12, and she came over with a group of students who were placed in homes in our area to learn English. The two of us got along quite well and played together. I'll admit it, at 10 years old, I was still totally into Barbies. I even had what I called the Barbie box, which was a big Rubbermaid bin that they all lived in when I wasn't playing with them. The two of us played Barbies a fair amount and had fun doing so. One day, shortly before they were going to fly back home, I noticed that two of my favorite Barbies were missing. I emptied out the whole box and I still couldn't find them. I looked everywhere. Finally, I told my mom. She was mortified to do this, but couldn't think of another way. One day when our house guest was out, my mom went and looked in her suitcase and found the Barbies hidden there. My mom was then concerned about what to do. She didn't want to admit that she had looked in the girl's suitcase, but she also knew that it was something she couldn't really let slide. So she went privately to the girl's aunt, who also happened to be on the trip, and explained the situation. The aunt was mortified. The girl's actions had brought shame on the family, and this caused them such grief. I still remember that they came to the house, the girl, her aunt, and her sister, and they were all crying. They were so ashamed and embarrassed, and the actions of this 12-year-old spoke badly to their whole family and their family name. My mother and I also got teary, and I remember feeling guilty and a little ashamed for causing my mom to get to the root of this problem and therefore causing such strife for the family. This is one example of what shame can do and how it can impact people when they are established in a shame-based culture. The younger son in this story behaved shamefully in a number of ways. By initially asking his father for his share of his father's wealth, the younger son behaved shamefully. It was not unusual for a father to divide his property before his death, such as if he wanted to retire, but it was pretty callous and heartless of the younger son to ask him to do so. I've heard some people say that this is almost the equivalent of saying, "I wish you were dead," to his father. I'm sure many out there would be offended and hurt if their child came to them and asked for what they would inherit when their parent died. Not to mention, for many, it could be hard to live on half of what you previously had. It would be like having your salary or your pension check cut in half because your child demanded the other half. That's quite a lot to ask. Additionally, the son turning around and selling the property, turning it into cash, would have been offensive at that time, not to mention his running away to a distant country. Unlike in many places today, children stayed close to home in Jewish society. They cared for their parents, would have lived close to home and worked on the land of the generations before. It probably wasn't too different from the people in the 1800s. Perhaps the father believed that his son would live on his portion of the land and work on the land, instead of selling it to someone else. That would have been another blow. Then there were the ways in which the son spent his money. We're not given details, but we're told it was in dissolute living, and the rest is left up to our imagination. Likely as not, this would have been shameful behavior too. Although it took place in a distant country, it's not impossible that this information could have gotten back to their friends and neighbors, adding another layer of shame for the family. The final nail in the coffin would have been that the son ran out of money and a famine hit the land, and the son went to work. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with working by any means. However, the younger son went to work feeding the pigs. In Jewish society, that was the lowest of the low. Pigs are unclean animals for Jewish people, and to feed them would have been demeaning work. Beyond that, the younger son was so hungry that he actually wanted to eat what the pigs were eating. This would have almost been like wishing he were a pig. It seems that this is what finally brings him back to his senses. He realizes how far he has sunk and decides to do something about it. He decides to return home and offer to work for his father as the lowest level of laborer. To bring this to a modern day level, it would be like the son of a CEO of a big company running away, spending all of his money, working as a noble person who cleans up after the Super Bowl, and being so hungry that he wanted to eat the food that he finds in the stands, and then realizing he would be better off offering to work as the one who cleans the pencil sharpeners at his father's company. In this realization, the son has enough humility to recognize that his father may not accept him back, and has no reason to, having given his son everything he deserves, and then some. And yet, despite all of this, the father responds with absolute love and kindness for his son. He even runs to greet his son, something that wouldn't typically be expected in a culture where seniors were to be honored and respected. Not only does he welcome him, but he has a party to do so. After all that the son has done, his father not only loves him, but celebrates him. And he doesn't just welcome him home with a nice meal, he goes all out. He dresses his son in the best clothes, puts expensive jewelry on him, and kills the fatted calf for him. The closest thing that I can think of today would be taking the son out to a designer clothing store, buying the most expensive item in the store for him to wear, then going around the corner and buying all the gold chains money can buy, before heading over to the keg for a feast of lobster and steak with all of his friends and family. Not exactly the way a father would be expected to react when his runaway son returns. In this reaction, however, we can see the love and forgiveness of the father. He absolutely adores his son and is so overjoyed that he has come back to him. He wants to do all that he can to demonstrate that love. He had thought that his son was lost to him, and yet his son realized the error of his ways and returned home. Then we have the older son. He's not so impressed with the younger son, who ran off and led a frivolous life for a time. When I was doing the research for this sermon, I came across a commentary that pointed out that the older brother gets way more specific than the text about what his brother was doing. In the text, we are told that he squandered his property in dissolute living, which leaves a lot to the imagination. We're not told exactly what he did, but it probably wasn't what most people would consider upstanding and moral living. The older brother, however, gets specific, stating to his father that the younger son has devoured your property with prostitutes. This commentary suggested that perhaps the older brother himself had considered doing these sorts of things, and may even have jealously imagined what he would have done in his brother's place. Likely because of these things, the older son refuses to enter the party, which would have been shameful for the family as well, and his father had to come out and talk to him, pleading him to see the other side of the situation. What I find so interesting is that the parable ends here. We're not given the end of the story. It's not clear what the older son chooses to do. We don't even hear how he responds to the father. Maybe he came up with a sassy or witty response before grudgingly going inside. Maybe he enters the party, forgiving his brother, and goes to live happily with his family in joy. Maybe he goes to the party angrily, but eventually comes to terms with the choices of his family. Maybe he turns away from his father, refuses to go into the party, and continues to hold a grudge for years to come. All of these are options, and I can see different people responding in this situation in different ways. When you hear this story, who do you see as most like you? I'd like to tell myself that I would be the father, with the absolute forgiving love and kindness for the son who had wronged him. After all, this son ran away with all that the father had given him, with the intention of never seeing him again. That must have hurt. And yet he models love and grace to the son. Unfortunately, I think that I see myself more in the older brother. I think this is why I felt I had to tell my mom when I was 10 and my Barbies went missing. It wasn't fair that they would be taken from me, especially my favorite ones. For me, it isn't necessarily holding grudges, but being concerned about the fairness of things and being frustrated when things occur in a way that I see as unfair or unjust. As my mom sometimes puts it, cutting my nose off to spite my face. And isn't that exactly what the older son does here? Rather than accepting what is and seeing the blessings that he has, he decides to spite his father by not going to the party. After all, the older son has lived and been cared for in the father's home. Yes, it required work and sacrifice on his part, and he didn't just get a free ride, yet he had everything that he could need. His father gently reminds him of that, saying, "Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." Sometimes it can be so hard to see what's in front of us, and to realize that we have what we could need or desire, especially when we see the things that other people have. The older brother in this scenario is jealous of how easy it has been for his brother. He may not have even been aware of the struggles his brother faced when he was away from home. Perhaps he even saw these as consequences, or that his brother deserved what came to him. What does it take to shift from this perspective of judgment and things being fair to one of loving kindness and compassionate forgiveness, as is modeled by the Father? I think it takes examining ourselves and our hearts. It takes considering the other person and looking at things from their point of view, seeing the value of the other, their experiences, and their choices. After all, who here hasn't made a mistake at one point and hoped for forgiveness? We're all human, and this is a part of our nature. Thankfully, we have a God who is like the Father in this story, willing to forgive us, love us, and celebrate us, overjoyed when we return to him. We are called to be Christ-like in the way we live our lives, and as such, we try to be as much like Christ as we can. To me, it seems that this means being like the loving and forgiving Father in this story. Rather than feeling the judgment and resentment of the older son, I challenge you and myself to face these situations with loving compassion. Amen.